moderating this important panel with NIAC's distinguished guests, Dine, Zogby, and Aram, Hamparian. Each of these panelists has accomplished incredible feats for their diaspora, and through their efforts, they've become pathways for the rest of us. We're grateful that they're going to share their wisdom and guide us through our journey to action and true influence. I'd like to start us by offering a distinction between ethnic communities, diasporas, and strategic diasporas. An ethnic community is a group that shares the same foods, rituals, and culture. To be called a diaspora, however, some people have argued that a community needs to have at least three more things. A common cause, like never again, or genocide, etc. A sense of co-responsibility to the common cause, like members giving as much as they can regardless of ability and not rely only on a few givers. And mobilization for action, not just meet for parties to get together, but to meet to work together. Strategic diasporas take the game to a whole new level. They build social capital, organizing across important elements like business, politics, philanthropy, and culture. And by culture, I mean seamless integration into the American mainstream. Becoming extroverted, as you know, is an important milestone for a diaspora. The Jewish community was very involved in civil rights movement in the 60s. And for example, even though it makes up 2.5% of the population, it gives 25% of the mega gifts, gives over $10 million, and gives most of those outside of the Jewish community. Many of us are beneficiaries of the hospitals and many other services that those gifts support. None of these elements is a silver bullet. Being successful in business by itself does not buy social capital. Iranian is our prime example. Developing the same passion, persistence, and focus to other elements like political mobilization, strategic philanthropy, and volunteerism, and weaving one's diaspora story and identity into the American experience is what makes a diaspora truly powerful. Our panelists today each have represented and led strategic diasporas who have climbed these ladders to varying extents. Among the many accomplishments of our panelists is the fact that they've organized some of the most formidable lobbies in the United States. As you know, successful diaspora lobbies try to influence the viewpoints of local, state, federal government towards their agenda. They serve as a liaison between their communities and country of interest. They're very effective in representing interests of those people, such as aid, trade, favorable policies, etc. But also, a couple of their strategies that are important to their success. They'll speak more to their own strategies of success. But a couple of things that they all share is one is self-awareness, which is having numbers, knowing what your accurate census looks like, figuring out how many people are registered to vote, what the issues and interests of the diaspora are, in what areas of the country they can affect elections. And Dr. Zogby's Arab American Institute, for example, is a wonderful example of a group that understands its people, regularly conducts litmus tests, particularly in the areas where Arab Americans have a significant sway in election results. While Arab Americans make up only a tiny slice of the total U.S. population, about 1.5 million, by census calculations, through AEI, their cluster in major battleground states like Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida are being used very strategically. Another success factor for the lobbies is commitment to participation at all levels. They help public service, they encourage people to participate in public service, local, state, federal, and also judiciary, the military. For example, again, the Jewish community, although 2.5% of the U.S. population, about 30% of the justices on the Supreme Court are Jewish, 8.5% of the U.S. Congress, etc. So very big commitment to public service. So these organizations represented by our panelists keep great status on themselves, statistics on themselves in the community. They determine votes in national elections, make the most of concentrated enclaves of citizens, have been successful in narrating their story and making it part of the American story. And they secure aid and work for the interests of both countries. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Tom Dine to my right. He was the executive director of the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee from 1980 to 1993, and is credited for single-handedly turning AIPAC into the lobbying powerhouse that it is today. Mr. Dine pushed AIPAC ahead by being an active voice in U.S. policy creation for the first Gulf War. Previously, he worked for the Senate Budget Committee as an advisor to Senator Muskie on nuclear weapons policy and the strategic arms limitation talks, and as an advisor to Senator Kennedy on defense and foreign policy. Tom also previously served as Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, as President of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague, and as Assistant Administrator for Europe and New Independent States of Eurasia at USAID. Currently, he serves on the Israel Policy Forum U.S. Advisory Council, an organization that works for a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through advocacy, education, and policy research. In 1987, in the middle of Dine's tenure, the New York Times described AIPAC as a major force in shaping United States policy in the Middle East. And in 1997, Fortune magazine named AIPAC the second most powerful influence group in Washington, D.C. after AARP. AIPAC has been able to secure widespread support for its aims for Israel, both within the Jewish community and within the wider American community, and has intertwined its efforts and narrative with the very values that make us Americans: freedom and self-determination. AIPAC has worked closely with Congress to ensure that Israel receives significant financial assistance to protect itself against threats in the region. One such outcome is the production of Israel's Aram anti-missile system at a Boeing plant in Huntsville, Alabama, for use for both the United States and Israel. AIPAC has also helped procure up to $3 million in aid yearly, making Israel the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign assistance since World War II. The Washington Report on Middle East Affairs has estimated total aid since 1949 at approximately $108 billion. I hope you forgive me for going thoroughly through these bios, even though that was the trend this morning. But I think it's important to realize what a great career these distinguished gentlemen have, and how hard they've worked to get to where they were and what they've done since, in case of Mr. Dine. Similarly, Mr. James Zogby was the chief architect of the Iranian-American organizing effort, and in particular has much experience organizing at the grassroots level. Dr. Zogby is the author of Arab Voices and the founder and president of Arab-American Institute, an organization which serves as a political and policy research arm of the Arab-American community. James is a lecturer and scholar on Middle East issues and a global professor of social research and public policy at New York University, Abu Dhabi. He's a member of the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee. He's also the director of Zogby Research Services, with the help of Zogby companies, one of which is headed by his brother John. AAI has become a key example of how useful statistics can be for a mobilization effort. Zogby polls for a wide spectrum of business media, government, and political groups, conducting public opinion research in more than 70 countries, and has helped AAI regularly produce a demographic fact sheet on Arab Americans in the United States, due in large part to vision and leadership of Dr. Zogby. AAI was able to overcome what he once called a period of deafening silence. The period through the 1980s and 1990s when many politicians chose to avoid possible conflicts of interest by simply not engaging with Arab American groups. AAI has overcome the silence and made engagement with Arab Americans necessary by recruiting voters in target areas throughout the country, hosting issue forums to cover matters of interest. AAI was specifically founded as a political organizing tool and reached unprecedented heights in 2004 when Arab Americans had an instrumental role in re-electing George Bush. Its most significant goal is to have a hand in shifting the national discourse and American foreign policy towards a less Israel-centric Middle East approach. Accordingly, and in stark contrast to the period of silence, recently Muslims and Arab American advocates have participated in policy discussions and received briefings from top White House aides and other officials in healthcare, legislation, foreign policy, the economy, immigration, and national security. Specifically, in 2010, they met privately with Senior White House Advisor Valerie Jarrett, Attorney General Eric Holder, to discuss civil liberties concerns and counterterrorism strategy. And finally, Mr. Aram Hamparian serves as ANCA's national point person with the administration, Congress, the media, and the Washington, D.C. foreign policy community. In cooperation with regional offices, more than 50 local chapters, dozens of coalition partners, hundreds of community affiliates, and thousands of grassroots activists, Mr. Hamparian works daily on a broad range of legislative, policy, research, political campaign, media, coalition, community-related concerns. He's testified before the Congress, lectured at National Defense University, at Foreign Service Institute, and USAID, and been featured, I'm sure you can see in his very illustrious bio at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, etc. Due in large part to the efforts of Mr. Hamparian at ANCA, Hillary Clinton has been intimately involved in nurturing the reconciliation between the Turkish and Armenian governments. Secretary Clinton has previously admitted, "I'm on the phone probably more with leadership in Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan than any part of the world," if this is before the Arab Spring. As a candidate for president in 2008, Mr. Obama vowed to use the term genocide to describe the ultimate mass slaughter of Armenians nearly a century ago, something recent presidents would not even consider. ANCA counted the rhetoric of our president a true success, although regrettably, Mr. Obama is yet to fulfill the promise. Taking up the cause of constituents, ANCA asked PBS to cancel the controversial 2006 PBS program of a debate over Armenian genocide. Because of ANCA's efforts, the PBS station in Los Angeles, a city that boasts a population of nearly 400,000 Armenians, decided not to broadcast the controversial program. Commendably, ANCA places real emphasis on participation in the American electoral process at the federal, state, and local levels by educating elected officials about Armenian-American issues and providing Armenian-American voters with up-to-date information about the positions of candidates on Armenian-American concerns. ANCA is in touch with this community constantly. Now let's hear from our speakers themselves in terms of how they have attained these enormous feats. I've asked them to kindly tell us a little bit about their community in numbers, in terms of the metrics they track, a snapshot of how the community looks today, what are some of the key strategies, milestones they've accomplished, and what are some of the obstacles, and then I'll ask them about their advice for us specifically. But first about their organizations. Mr. Dine?
Well, thank you, Noosheen. And a pleasure to be here. A pleasure to be on the same podium with Jim and Aram. I've been involved, although you read a long bio, just wanted to add a couple of other vignettes. My wife and I have been to Iran in 1969. I don't know if those were the good old days or not, but it was at least I can say I've been there, because I don't think there's anybody in the U.S. government today who could say that, at least overtly. Secondly, when I was at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I got Congress to authorize Radio Farda, which is a Persian language broadcast to Iran, which the regime doesn't like, probably never will, but at least it's, particularly through the internet now, been a source of dialogue to a certain extent. Let me make a couple of general comments, and then I'll get into your desire for statistics, although not many. Number one, we're talking about lobbies. We're not talking about feel good, do good charities. And I've had this conversation with Trita Parsi. I'll go public now. I believe that NIAC has to go from being a 501c3, which is tax deductible, to a 501c4, which allows you to lobby full-time. Because in lobbying, you create an agenda. You create your agenda, you advocate it with elected members of Congress and other representatives, and you shape the national agenda. And that's your goal. It's not the other stuff. You can do that other stuff in a different way. And I think it's very important to understand that. And what is lobbying? There's a definition out of the Yale Political Science Department in the 1940s, 50s, which said, B gets A to do what he doesn't or she doesn't want to do. That describes a marriage, that describes bilateral relations, that describes the interaction with those who do shape firsthand a national policy. I've had a chance just to look through the notebook, your briefing book, somewhat, and I see the word grassroots. And Noosheen mentioned it, and Jim's been involved with that full time, and so has Aram. Grassroots political action. It's just not grassroots. That's where you live. It's what you do where you live. And every citizen of this country is represented federally by 2 senators and 1 congressman. And if you've got 2 homes, maybe 2 congressmen. But those are the people that you want to influence, as well as an administration. But often the way to get to an administration is through members on Capitol Hill. The lobbying group has to be representative of the community. And I'll come back to the word community. It has to be like-minded citizens. You can't go into Office X like you're going to do tomorrow and say one thing and go to Office Y and say another thing. Yeah, it has to be disciplined, drilled, clear, and it's the elevator speech. You can't give a lecture. And I come from a community that loves the lecture. and it has been, it will be always difficult to keep people to less than 90 seconds. Since there are no members of Congress here, but I've said it in front of members of Congress, they have an attention span of 40 seconds. Not because they're dumb, not because they don't care, but they've got a daily schedule that goes from 6 a.m. to midnight. And it's dealing with a lot of people, with a lot of information, and you've got to make your information memorable. Be bipartisan. When I first went to AIPAC, the community the Jewish community was overwhelmingly Democratic. And frankly, Democrats thought they owned the pro-Israel issue. And I started advocating bipartisanship. My dear wife, who's here today, gave me hell, and so did others. I can still remember Barney Frank yelling at me. I can still remember Paul Sarbanes yelling at me. But to be national policy, it has to be bipartisan, and of course the city now has forgotten that almost totally. And finally, I would say, to summarize this beginning, you need a mission that is clear. I think I know what the goals of NIAC are, but I'm not sure. And if I'm not sure, because I care about this organization and about the U.S.-Iranian relationship, then either you got to educate me or do a better job at what you are trying to achieve. And now getting down into the hard part, are you trying to prevent war? Are you trying to build a strong bilateral relationship between the regime in Tehran and our government here? What is it that you stand for? Because in your clarity and in your 90-second briefing to a member of Congress, that person has to know too. And I stand corrected if you think you are clear. You need a body of citizens, and many of you are part of this. You need a body of citizens at the grassroots. I tried to emphasize, and I still do, citizens and all responsibilities that come with that. So you have to know who represents you. You have to know who your elected officials are locally, in the county, at the state level, and of course the federal level, if you're going to affect national policy. But ladies and gentlemen, the people that make up the national leadership of our country have all come from school boards, county this, but state representative that. Get them early, get them often, and stick with them. They're looking for friends. When you have a lobby and you're working both in Washington and at the grassroots level, I found the most exciting part of my work previously was to create what I call unison. What the people at the grassroots say to their congressman or senator on a weekend meeting will be said the same thing will be said here in Washington by NIAC in this case, or others. You can't give different messages, and when those messages are in unison, it leaves an impression. Members always feel there's, ooh, this is influential. This is power. In hearing some of what you said, I wasn't quite sure, but I believe in separating domestic policy efforts from foreign policy efforts. Now, the community I know best, the Jewish community, started on domestic policy in the early 20th century. How to take care of all the refugees from Russia, Tsar's Russia, and Soviet Union, and make sure they didn't become a burden on the state. So it was the welfare federation that grew up around the country. And today, even though we're a very successful community in a variety of ways, there are 155 what are called federations in Canada and the United States who are the main sources of raising money to help those in need. And most people don't believe there are Jews in need. And I'll take you on a tour of New York City sometime, and I'll show you poverty. I like your phrase, build a movement. Yeah, when people think about Iran, U.S.-Iranian relations, whether or not they like the government in Tehran or not, I don't know anybody that likes the government. You got to think, you want people to think of you with that because you've got muscularity. You know what you're talking about. You're clear-minded. And finally, everything you do, say, has to be in the American interest. The American interest. I could go on.
I think this is fantastic. It's a great start. Thank you. There's so many pearls in this.
Start by saying that one of the things I learned was how ethnic groups are all the same, but you all started exactly at 1:30, and that breaks the rule right there. It's not on. I heard it. It's on. The second thing is, I will take issue as I talk with the question of ethnic versus diaspora. I was invited to speak at the first diaspora gathering at the State Department. It was probably the last time I'll be invited to speak. Because when they asked me to comment on the word diaspora, I rejected it. And I'm not living in diaspora. I'm living in America. I'm a citizen born here and feel very strongly that my dad did not come from Lebanon to have me live in exile. I'm part of this country and I'm fighting for full recognition of my citizenship rights and won't surrender them to the State Department but also won't surrender them to the Middle East. It was interesting that at the very same time I was getting that invitation, I was being invited to speak at a Diaspora conference sponsored by the Arab League, and I had turned them down saying, I'm not living in Diaspora, I'm living in America, and we're citizens, and that's how we see ourselves. And so it was the same problem on both ends of the spectrum. I'll talk more about that later. And not to one-up Tom, I've never been to Iran, but I've polled in Iran 4 times, and have polled Iranian Americans 4 times. And you might, if we have time, share some insights I've learned from that experience, because polling for me is something I've grown to love. I call it the respectful science. It opens a window, lets voices in, gives you a chance to hear from people in a way that you don't get to hear from them through any other medium. This year at the Democratic Convention, we had 55 Arab American delegates. It was a remarkable turnout. It was actually the highest we ever had. And it was noteworthy for its diversity. They were Christian and Muslim. They were from 20 states. They represented so many different countries. Obviously, the majority were Syrian Lebanese descent. That's the majority of the community. But we also had the first Somali American. We had the first Saudi Arabian American woman. We had an Iraqi American who has an incredible story to tell of having been in prison, come here 5 years later, get citizenship, and 2 years later be elected as a delegate. We had similarly kids who were grandchildren of the immigrants who come at the turn of the century, the last century. We had elected officials, we had party leaders, we had community activists. And we all gathered at one point for lunch at a Lebanese restaurant in downtown Charlotte. And we shared stories about how we got there. How each of them got there, however, was one story. The other story for me was how we got there as a community. And it's a story I love to tell, and it's a story worth telling, because it wasn't easy. Back in the 70s, Arab Americans were involved, but were involved in politics as Lebanese Americans. There was a Lebanese Americans for Carter. There was at one point Reagan had a Syrian American committee. People used the country ID to define themselves. That's how they saw themselves, and that was the identity that was available. But something began to happen in the early 70s, not just in my community, but actually across the country. As part of the cultural revolution that was shaping America at the end of the 60s and early 70s, was not just the peace movement, the civil rights movement, and the countercultural movement, but there was also an ethnic identity movement. It grew up at the tail end of the civil rights movement when a cultural nationalism emerged. I remember watching Alex Haley's Roots. Some of you might remember that. The story, it was a fictive story that Alex Haley had written about his ancestors coming as slaves from Africa. But I remember watching that series and saying, I have a story too. I have roots. And I was in graduate school at the time, and it was interesting sharing that, my reaction to that with kids from other backgrounds who similarly became aware through that movement of their own ethnic identity. The notion that we were all Leave It to Beaver, or that there was a dominant culture and the rest of us were somehow not quite ready to participate in that, we weren't white enough, gave way to this feel for being ethnic. I wasn't Bubba. I wanted to say who I was and what my tradition and heritage was and feel good about it. It's funny because, there were kids in class that I had, the other side of the room, looked a little like me, had a name that was a little bit, I knew it was of Arabic. It almost didn't matter what country he was from or what religion he was. I kind of knew him of the same, that he was of the same ethnicity. Sometimes they make mistakes, and there'd be Armenian kids who'd get into the mix, but because they come from Lebanon, we shared a common heritage, and we felt very strongly about being together. We formed clubs. We formed different initiatives on campus that reflected that sense of being of a common heritage. It didn't take political shape until we got into the 1980s. And And it was not easy going. And I'll describe the reasons why in a minute, but it was 1984 with Jesse Jackson that we had our first, if you will, coming out party. Jesse Jackson was the first political person to recognize Arab American as an identity, as an ethnicity. He said, this is going to be my secret weapon, and it was. We mobilized for him in different states around the country. We raised a significant amount of money. Actually, the most interesting one was the fundraiser we did at the very end in California, where Jesse said to me, he said, your community's arrived. We did a big fundraiser in San Diego yesterday, and there was no press coverage. Meaning that there was no Arab money for Jesse Jackson story in the newspaper that day. I got to introduce him at the Democratic Convention, and it was, for us, a big deal. We had 4 delegates at the convention that year. That's about what we had in years previous, even when they were counted as just Lebanese or Syrian. But in the next 4 years, we mobilized rather extensively, and we increased our numbers to 52 by 1988. We faced a lot of difficulties back then. Some of the difficulties we faced were internal to the community. As with any new movement, there were identity issues that had to be reconciled. There were those who continued to insist, taking their identity cue from quote-unquote back home, the more recent immigrants, were Lebanese, or they were members of the they identified with different political parties in Lebanon. We're Phalange. We are not Arab, we are Christian. We're more French than we are. I mean, there were all these different things going on. There were those who were maintained their identity from religion, those who maintained their identity from their country of origin. There were those who maintained their identity from their village, or from, in some cases, their family. We had people from the same village who came from 2 different branches of the family, and everyone knows that that family doesn't marry with that family because that happened 200 years ago, and God knows what they gave birth to, and we're still living with that, the legacy of that, the product of that, that offspring, that marriage brought us. We had to overcome those internal difficulties, and we still deal with them every day. With new immigrants, there's constantly this issue of the divisions and the complex identities from back home. We also faced some problems that were external to the community. And I say this with all due respect to the fact that Tom is here with me, but we had another community, I'll be gentle about it, that delegitimized us, that didn't want us involved, and that did everything they possibly could to malign us, or to marginalize us, or in some cases to demonize us. And it was quite painful. I mean, I'd get invited someplace to speak, and they'd have a briefing paper about who I was. I'd get an offered a teaching job and be told, well, we can't have you because we just heard from such and such, and you know who he really is. That has continued, incidentally, until today. It has not gone away. And it has been a difficult issue that we have had to face, which is that some folks see this as a zero-sum game where we can't play in the sandbox. And steps will be taken that are oftentimes quite unfair to eliminate our participation. We dealt with the issues. We continue to struggle with the issues. We had candidates give money back. We had parties refuse to meet with us. We had people who simply would not recognize us as a legitimate community. By 1988, our numbers grew, our organization level grew, our ability to function grew. We focused on the local level. We mixed what you called ethnicity politics with the issue politics because it was important to us. It was important that our people felt a common bond. It was marvelous to go to an event in Chicago and have somebody get up and say, in a community that had, in the decade preceding that, had a Palestinian dinner or a Jordanian dinner or a Moroccan dinner or whatever, and have them say, okay, those of you who are from Egypt stand up, and those of you who are, and you'd see this in a room of 1,500 people, this incredible diversity, functioning as an Arab community, eating the same food, listening to the same music, and sharing many concerns. that brought them together to feel good. I would add one additional difficulty we faced that was external, and that was unique to this country. I was at an event, we always did these get out the vote events where we would have an Arabic band and Arabic music, and we would do it a couple of nights before the election. We'd mobilize youth volunteers, and they'd go door to door in the communities to knock on doors or make phone calls or do that work. I had a reporter from the Plain Dealer come to me and say, your people do this? Do you have to do this because they come from countries where people don't vote? And I responded at first sarcastically saying, oh no, my people come from countries where everybody votes. 99% for the president and 99% for the president in Syria. But I said, no, actually the problem is my people come to a country where people don't vote. And the inertia and apathy that exists in American life is one of the huge hurdles to overcome. We discovered in Michigan, for example, that our participation could double our numbers by impact because we actually cared more than most of them. In a state where there's only about 150,000 people turn out in the caucuses, if we turned out 30,000 people, we actually ruled. We did it in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where our numbers were very small, but we were so organized that we were able to have a huge impact in the Iowa caucuses. And in other states as well, breaking the apathy and turning aside the inertia and creating some momentum made a huge difference for a small community. I'd also add that there were allies. It wasn't just our work. At one of the most painful periods of our exclusion, at the time of the Clinton campaign in 1992, it's a long story, but it was a painful one. I decided that I needed additional help. Ron Brown had been working with us, and Ron was just great. He withstood pressures of his own to marginalize us. There were people who told him, do not work with them, stay away from them, etc. And Ron said no, and worked with us. But at one point, he was not able to break the roadblocks to get us into the Clinton campaign. And so I went to Joe Lieberman. And look, I do not agree with Joe Lieberman on much, on most issues. I really don't. But I will never forget him. And when Joe ran for re-election, and there were those who wanted me to support his opponent, I could not do that. Because I will never forget going to see Joe Lieberman and saying, I have a problem, Joe. And the problem is we can't get into the Clinton campaign, and some people in your community are playing zero-sum politics with us. Joe got on the phone with George Stephanopoulos and said, I want these people in, and I want them in now. And the next day I was down in Little Rock. And so the combination of Jesse Jackson helping us mobilize, and Ron Brown opening the door, and Joe Lieberman moving us into the door, and then Bill Clinton, who was a marvelous president for inclusive reasons of inclusion, made a huge difference for us. The respect that we got during the 90s, and I would say that politics had a lot to do with it on the international arena. I mean, it was clear that the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, was in many ways a painful thing for us to see our two worlds collide as they did. But it was also an opportunity for us to articulate concerns and to talk about our experiences, and the attention that we got from the media, and we were ready to take advantage of that and tell our story, speak responsibly about American interests in the region, and understand the issues in Kuwait and what was going on there for people. Those of us who'd been to Kuwait, we knew the country and knew its people. And the fact that we were able to mobilize the Iraqi American community who could speak about Saddam and what the regime meant, that we were able to deal with issues involving the peace process when that happened. I mean, when the Clinton people came to us in '93 and said there's a signing ceremony, we need lists, and we had them. If we didn't have them, we would have been irrelevant to that process. If a congressman calls and says, I'm doing something in your district, in my district, I need people, who do you got? And we can't get on the lists, we might as well not even be worth doing what we're doing. And so it was a level of organization. To be sure, I never forget actually the first time I met with Paul Tully, who was the sort of legendary political director for Ron Brown. at the time of the Democratic Committee. Ron said, look, I'm breaking this problem. We're not going to deal with this problem. I want you involved in the party, and I want you to meet Paul Tully. And he said, but before you meet Paul Tully, you better be ready. He's tough, and he doesn't suffer fools lightly. I went in to see Paul Tully, and the first thing he said to me, I think without looking at me as I recall, you got people, where are they? And you got lists, can we get to them? And I was ready. I had my lists, and I knew where my people were, and I knew how to get to them, and we were able to fit rather comfortably into that operation. So the issues began to move in a direction that brought us in. There was leadership external to us that brought us in, but there was also our ability to organize that we wouldn't have been able to take advantage of these moments had we not been ready to do it. I would say just a couple of things. The first is, our communities are different. There's no question about it. We come from many different countries, many different religions, we have many different even ethnicities within our broader cultural heritage of being of Arab descent. But in fact, despite being one country, Iran is as complex in many ways. I know from the polling I've done that even the generational differences of when you came from Iran, in some cases, means a difference in attitude. And so looking at that, as I polled Iranian Americans, knowing who you are is very important. Knowing the differences, knowing what the common ground themes are is important, but also knowing what the issues are that divide you are important. Being able to either reconcile them or face them honestly. Sometimes the most important meetings I've ever had with the Arab community have not been where we organize people to do something. It's when over Syria, for example, where the community is intensely divided. You hear from the Syrian exiles. You don't hear from the Syrian Christian community that is scared stiff of what will happen if the Assad regime goes. They don't like him. He's a butcher. They know it. But they're more afraid about the future than they are about the present. The most important meetings I've been able to do have been trying to bring the two communities together to talk about it in national dialogues that we've sponsored between the supporters and the opponents of the regime, in some cases between the Christian and Muslim community. Sometimes it just breaks out that simply. In other words, to know the common ground, to know the differences, and to be able to act either to reconcile them or at least to air them out becomes very critical. The other thing is, I'm going to stop. Just make one final point.
Okay.
What are the issues that move us the most? I'll tell you. The issue that moves us the most right now is the economy. Bombs in Syria are going to kill my relatives. But the lack of jobs in Michigan is going to kill my kids. It's going to deny them the future. We have reverse immigration right now in Michigan, where families that have come here, gotten educated here, put their kids through school here, have had their kids go back to the Middle East looking for work. And so at the end of the day, this issue of being, as you called it, strategic, I mean, sometimes the most important thing we do is networking to help kids find jobs. It's to create the services that a community provides that gives you the strength to do some of the other things. The Jewish community has a longer history of organization. You were able to build on the pre-existing work and the continuing work of those. Our community didn't have those. And so we had to actually do all of the things that many of the diverse groups in the Jewish community do all at the same time. We had to help people get jobs in Washington. We had to help them network and find jobs back in their district. We had to, when somebody was running for school board, we had to help them raise money and form the lists of the people in the community to raise the money for them that way. We had to do the community needs assessments for people to start their social service agencies in the different communities. And in 30 years of doing that, we've built trust and partnerships around the country that today give us a presence in Washington that is based not on ideas, but on service. People know us and know the work we do and take it seriously.
Thank you.
And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Zogby. I've seen the work of Arab Americans in Michigan firsthand, and it is truly spectacular. I think I went to one Access event when where every politician in the state of Michigan was an honorary chair of that event. Every single person had signed something, and no one really gets elected in Michigan without Arab Americans. Aram.
Thanks so much. I first want to start off by thanking Trita, who's back there, by saying thank you to you and to NIAC. Wonderful event. I'm honored to be with you, Noosheen, Tom, Jim, and these three folks who have a treasure of insight and experience. They could talk for hours, and every idea they offer would be a gem. You cannot learn enough from these folks. Couple thoughts. Here in DC, when we talk about neighbors, if you've been next door to somebody for 5 or 10 years, you consider them a long-time neighbor. Our folks have been around for a lot longer. Between the Arabs, the Persians, the Armenians, and the Jews, we're neighbors of thousands of years. And because we've been neighbors and friends for so long, I want to speak to you as family, put aside all my kind of book learning, and just talk to you from my heart. I'll start with a quote. Every time I pass through Union Station, I stop at a statue. On the statue is a quote. It's my favorite quote. It's by a man named A. Philip Randolph, who was a labor organizer, a really remarkable guy. I'm going to read it to you. He said, "At the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take, and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you don't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything, and you can't take anything without organization. Without organization. Your organization is not that. Remember that later as I continue my talk. I will start my talk with a confession, I think a cultural confession. Organization is very much about teamwork, right? People working together, common goals, the ability to cooperate, things of that sort. Here's my confession. At the recently concluded Olympics, the Armenians did pretty well in terms of numbers, right? I think we got 3 medals, which is actually 26th per capita, so it's not so bad. That's the good news, right? By the way, the US, 49 per capita, Iran, 61st per capita. Number 1 per capita, Grenada. Number 2, Jamaica. But all the medals that we won, the medals the Armenians won were, as always, in individual sports. We did great in boxing, good in judo, good in weightlifting, everything individual, right? We just won the Chess Olympics, which is awesome for a country of 3 million people. We beat India, China, Russia, US, countries with vast populations. But the confession I'm making is that teamwork is just not pretty, right? Maybe it's our history, maybe it's our DNA, I don't know what it is, but that concept of teamwork is still a work in progress. It's been in progress now for a while now, but we're making progress, but it's one of the great challenges we face, one of the great challenges we face. As we face those challenges, I think there have been 4 ingredients. For those of you who like to take notes, these are the 4 things I like to share. There are 4 ingredients that mean an awful lot to us. And the first is, do you have a constituency? Do you have a community that cares about the issues that you care about, right? I would say yes, the answer is yes. The Iranian community does have people who care deeply about Iran, deeply about U.S. relations with Iran, deeply about peace in the region. If you did not, and it was NIAC's job to create that commitment and caring, you would be in vast trouble, because that cannot be created by an organization. That's created in homes, and in community groups, and in 1,000 different ways, right? By people who show up at the door of NIAC, at the door of advocacy, at the door of lobbying, already having that in their heart. It's hard for, the folks in this room did not become committed Iranian Americans at age 18 or 20 because you came to a conference. You're here because you were raised that way, or because something in your life, a mentor, a friend, somebody, a mom or dad, instill that in your spirit. So the first key is, do you have a community that cares? And the answer is yes. That's a very powerful thing. It's the deep well that you will return to time and time again. Second thing that you need after you have people that care is there a consensus? Is there a core consensus around common ground issues? Is there a willingness to cooperate, to kind of create what I would call a Persian space, Iranian space, a space where you define for yourselves what is important, and you manage for yourselves the differences. And my warning here is a very serious and sober one. If you do not manage your differences, others will manage your differences for you. And I've seen that a lot. I've seen that a lot when the issue of Iran comes up. Everyone's got a stake. Everyone's got their finger in the pie. Everyone's trying to drive it in their own direction, right? And the community has to have its own its own space, its own power, its own ability to basically arrive at a moment where you invite everyone else to leave the room and say, this is our moment to determine as a community what we believe and what we're going to take to the American table and ask for. What we're going to pitch Congress on, what the asks are that we bring to the administration. I think it's very important. The integrity of the community in building its own consensus, not being, held hostage or hijacked by others, and making its own judgments, and the ability to work together toward common aims. This is a great challenge. If we put 10 Armenians in a room, right, this is how 1,000 jokes start like this, right? But if you were to say, let's say, flip it around, let's say you have 10 issues, right? In one environment, if there's agreement on 9 issues, but disagreement on 1, that's sufficient to wreck the whole enterprise, right? Because you disagree on that one issue, the other guy is the devil, this guy is this one here, and all of a sudden the prospect of cooperation disappears because there's disagreement on one issue. And we all know that a more mature approach, the one that I think works in this city, is even if you were to disagree on 9 issues, right, you should still have the maturity and the discipline to cooperate on that one last issue. Don't view things as existential. Don't view things as, do or die. Don't view things as black and white. View it as political people, because that's the way the city operates. They operate as political people, not any other way. It's political. You got to be a little bit cold-blooded about it. So really discipline yourselves. I know I hate to sound like a lecture, because if anything, I'm speaking from my own experience, my own mistakes I've made and others along with me have made along the way. But very important to have that space to define your issues and to cooperate to the extent possible. I mean that very seriously, to the extent possible. So first is a community that cares. Second is do you have the ability to build consensus. A third is, do you know how the system works and do you know how to influence it? That's like a whole conference. That's why you're having this conference. I won't bore you with the details of how to influence American policies. Tom could write a book, probably has, and so could Jim, about that process. It has to do with organizing locally, having lists, working in campaigns, donating to candidates, things of that sort. All this stuff, right, of politics. You got to learn that. If you guys, I think, are by and large very well versed, you're the apostles who then take that to the next level of the community who's not in this room, but back in the community. So that brings you pretty far along the road. Do your folks care? Yeah. Do you have the ability to work together? Well, to be determined. That's I think, NIAC's the healthiest experiment, healthiest effort I've seen toward this end. Third, do you understand the system? Yes, you understand the system. If you don't understand it, a weekend at NIAC will teach you whatever you need to know. You'll go back home a soldier. By example, by experience, you'll become a leader in no time, right? From student to leader in no time. There's a fourth ingredient, which is the toughest one, right? And it's the one that's most often missing, and it's the hardest to define. And that is, I would call that belief or faith, right? It is somewhere in our history, I don't know where in our history, but deep down, at least in Armenian, and the heritage of Armenians, is the experience of being subjects for far longer than having been citizens, right? Decisions were made about Armenians for far longer than decisions were made by Armenians about Armenians. Armenians now in time for 21 years. And prior to that, we had a history of about 4,000 years, with very short windows of independence and freedom along the way. So it's very hard for a community with that experience, without a democratic tradition, to believe that democratic inputs and advocacy inputs result in actions, right? Very often there's a hopelessness, right, that says that, sure, I care about this issue, sure, we can agree on something, sure, I understand what should be done, but I'm not going to do it because I don't think it'll make a difference. It's futile. In fact, if you get involved in the political system, it'll backfire on you. Better to just prosper within whatever environment you're in, get a good education, go into the professions, keep low under radar, right? Stay off, keep a low profile, and remain safe. That's like, that philosophy may work in other parts of the world, and it may have worked in previous centuries. It does not work in the city. The squeaky wheel does get oiled. You need to be aggressive and push very hard. That's very, sometimes countercultural, but it's got to be done. And you guys are the guys to do it. You guys are the ones that are going to take that message to your community, and little by little, be the teachers to your community. You are the teachers of the community. You got to be patient. You got to hold hands. You got to lead people. Do sit down with them, explain to them. Just literally walk them through the process and build up that number until you have a vast army of people who you can count on to advance your cause. So I think that will result, I think, in a healthy political culture. I think you're far along that route, one in which it isn't just an organization in DC making asks all the time to the community, where it's a one-way street where DC asks wherever, Orange County or Florida or Maryland, whatever. It should also engender a bottom-up demand for activism, right? You guys working in the NIAC office, in the NIAC leadership, and the activist space, should be hearing all the time people saying, what are we doing? Why are we doing it up? When you get complaints about, hey, what about this? Why didn't you do this? That's the healthy side. That's what you want to work toward. So those are the 4 ingredients, in my experience. Community that cares, you got to build some consensus and cooperation. You need to understand the system and how to change it, and 4, you have to instill faith. America is the place where advocacy does make a difference. It just takes time. It requires a lot of patience, a lot of persistence. Jim, I think, is really a poster child of persistence. Tom, I think, is just an awesome example of how you can deliver results in this system. You can't view it as focused, you can't view it as fatalistic. This is around many a dinner table. I'm sure the discussion on politics has led to, oh, what can we do? Oh, we can't make a difference. Oh, it's a waste of time. That's poison. That's poison. It's a poison. It's a sickness that we have to overcome. And the organization is the way to do it. In my view, NIAC is the healthiest stream. I'm going to run through.
That's what I was just going to ask you. Can you run through the history of Armenian very briefly, please?
3 minutes. 100 years in 3 minutes. Okay? When Armenians first arrived in America, right? We were very poor, very uneducated, largely peasants from Anatolia arrived as refugees, right? Then they saw all this terrible stuff going on back home, and they were desperate to help. The genocide was taking place, there were massacres, deportations, and the best that they could organize in that era, 1890s through the 1920s, was to elicit the sympathy or the pity of the American people, right? And the American people did respond and sent a tremendous amount of relief aid, medicine, tents, orphanages. My grandmother was raised in an orphanage provided by the American people. So we have the pity of the American people on our side. The poor Christian nation suffering terribly, and an outpouring of sympathy resulted, right? That was good, but we recognize the limits of that, right? Having people feel sorry for you is like, they'll get you a tent, they'll get you some medicine and some relief, but it's not going to result in much more. And we learned that when the Kemalists and Bolsheviks decided to partition Armenia, all that talk about, the poor, starving Armenians, evaporated, meant nothing. So the first era was pity. Second era was partisanship. The world soon after broke into this Cold War, right? And Armenians, we had Armenia in the Soviet Union, and Armenians in the West, and Armenians took sides in this great global struggle, and we dealt with it existentially, as if the outcome of this great war was going to be decided by us, but it was not. Right? that war was going to be decided on its own terms by the principles, not by anything the Armenians did. But nonetheless, we spent 2 or 3 generations battling it out, beating up on each other, fighting, and when our fighting didn't matter. There were good arguments on both sides. I happen to believe that the American side, the pro-freedom Armenian side, was the right side. But looking back on it, we spent 2 or 3 generations killing each other. Would never do that again. The lesson never. Take sides tactically, but never strategically. You want to be on your own side, is my point. Third is the politics of protest. We started in the 60s to protest. We would go to every Turkish embassy and consulate and protest, and that was great. I don't miss a protest. I love protests. But you realize that protests have their serious limitations. The guy inside the building sees you yelling, right? They can say, okay, they'll be gone in a couple hours. They'll come back in 364 days, and we can generally safely ignore them. So while the protesting was good to wake ourselves up, right? Wake up the media and others to our cause, there were major limits to protesting. So, which brings us pity, limits to pity. Second, partisanship, there are limits to partisanship. Third, there are limits to protesting. This fourth and fifth are pressure, right? Which is what we all do now, right? The standard lexicon of pressure politics in America, campaign finance, elections, media, that's pretty much what I do every day. The fifth step, which is what we hope to evolve into more, is one of participation, right? Where we get larger numbers of Armenians into the system, into the media, into the State Department, into the Congress, things of that nature. So that we're not just the guys knocking on the door, but sometimes we're the guy on the other side of the door. It's not just the petitioner. Sometimes we want to be the person who's petitioning as well. So with that, I'll wrap up.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So I think in the interest of time, I'd like to open it up to the audience, if you don't mind, and have them ask questions, and then we can go back to use that time for everyone to comment. Hands in the back, all the way in the back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think the panel, the discussion was great. A lot of the issues that were raised reflect the challenges and discussions that we have within the American and Iranian community. I have two specific questions. Number one is that within our community, I think there's a big struggle, and a lot of it was reflected in the discussion already. We come from a background that, you know, our grandparents told our parents, don't get involved, be safe, don't get burned, you're going to go to prison in the old country. And now we're here, and we know if we're not at the table, we're on the table. So, but how do you jive the two scenarios? How do you teach, I guess, our community that you really need to shift your mindset from the old to the new? Is it just a matter of time and generations, or do we actually can teach ourselves, educate ourselves to get there? And my second point in question is, we also have internal debate within our community about, 2 points. One is that we don't want war with Iran, U.S. with Iran. And I think that's reflected on the polling within our community, Iranian Americans in this country. On the other side of the coin, none of us have really warm feelings for the regime there. And I want to see if, maybe within the Arab American community, if there's this dichotomy of, don't go to war with them, but also you have to use diplomacy. And if you do that, are you being accused by another sector of your community of being appeasing the regime?
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 2 more questions, and please keep your questions under 30 seconds. 2 more questions before we ask panel. Yes?
Hi, thank you very much. My question pretty much goes to Mr. Dine, and that is, how do we Americans interested in American foreign policy toward Iran break through the fear you put in Paul Findlay way back when, and remind the legislative branch of the government that, as you said in 1982, you don't work for Reagan. How could we remind them that they don't work for the government of Israel, they work for the American people? Thank you.
Next question. Actually, there was one right there. Yes, that one.
Hi, this is for Mr. Zogby. You said in your speech, you talked about how you rejected the label of diaspora at the State Department. And I'm an American, but I'm also part of a diaspora, and I want to know, what do you gain from rejecting that part? Because for me, I get a connection to all over the world with my diaspora label. So what is gained from the rejection?
Thank you. Let's hear from our panelists before we take more questions. Who would like to go?
I can touch on the how do we teach the community. You do that just with tremendous patience and persistence. You recognize that how do people learn? People don't learn by lecture. People don't learn by kind of intellectual stuff. They tend to learn by experience and by example, especially the people who give the example are people they respect. So it's a matter of building a core of people who really get it, who understand that the demands of today, the demands of Washington, D.C. require a very vocal, active community. You have that core, and then they go out one by one, patiently hand-holding people who are going to come in next, and walk them through the process. Bring them to the first congressional meeting. They won't say anything. Maybe they'll take notes. The second meeting, they'll ask a question. The third meeting, they'll talk. The fourth meeting, they can run. There's no shortcut. It's patience and persistence. I would offer one thought, which is like hate the sin, love the sinner kind of dichotomy, which is that you really have to aggressively target the fatalism and hopelessness in the community. I think you can hate that fairly, because that's an unhealthy thing. It's a sickness, in my opinion, right? But love the sinner, because look, why do our communities bring that forward to this era? It's because of our history. I mean, you can't condemn people for that, but at the same time, you got to aggressively target the hopelessness.
I agree with you. I'll give you experience. The American Jewish community before and during World War II did very little about what was taking place in Europe. There were times when, and the community was divided and debated the issue, what to do, when the word about the Holocaust was coming through louder and clearer. Afterwards, the community, and I'm talking about the late 40s and 50s, even the 60s, became haunted by the indifference, by the doing nothing. And my generation was the first, I have to be careful here, but we think we're the first, that said, hell no. It's not a question of never again, but we could have pulled the levers of power if we had tried. And there was debate, there was a famous rabbi in New York named Silver, who was known to Roosevelt. And he had opportunities to talk to Roosevelt and didn't put it down in front of him and say, Mr. President, you've got to bomb this, and this, these targets, or whatever, to break up the concentration camps. He was opposed by another rabbi in Cleveland called Silver, and so deep divisions. But by the time I came of age, even before I came to age, boy, I just knew it was going to be action. It was not going to be passivity. So you learn from experience better than you learn just by reading a book or listening to one of us scholars.
Thank you. James?
There were a couple of points I'd like to make. First on the teaching. I don't know if you can take people from not wanting to be involved to being involved, or from not understanding the need to. You have to be ready for those who are ready to be involved. And the teaching you do is teaching those who are ready to become engaged how better to use the power that they've got. If I've learned any one thing over these years, it's that you can't organize everybody, but you can organize the people who are ready to be organized and who want to play in the game. If you spend too much time trying to get people who aren't ready to get organized, trying to teach them about the importance of getting organized, you waste a whole lot of resources. Whereas you got a whole generation of young people who are itching to get involved and just don't know how to. Or a bunch of folks who aren't at that point in their lives when they're ready to give to something that makes sense. And so it's like fishing, you know, it's like you cast the net and you see who you get, and the ones you get, you got to use them right. And you just can't be for everybody. You have to be for those who are ready to do what needs to be done. The issue of war or not is one, I know from the polling that we've done, it's a huge concern in this community, especially for those in this community who have family back in Iran. The interesting gap in your community is not on the demographic side, it's those who have family in Iran and those who don't have family in Iran. They have wildly different approaches to war in the country. But I would suggest to you that as Americans, we need to look at this issue in a different way. Tell me the last one we had in the Middle East that actually served us well. And I tell this to the exiles all the time. I meet with them constantly. The Libyans, we will be your best friends, and the Syrians, we will return the whole Middle East. I met the Shalabi people. You know, I heard that shit from them. And that really worked. I remember meeting with the Afghanis in the early 80s telling me the same thing then too. And that one worked really well for us. And so at the end of the day, I suffer for what's happening in Syria. But is there a place for America in this? There is not. There is not. And in the polling we do in Iran, there is not a place for America in that at all right now. I mean, we're not, the green movement was not waiting for us to sprinkle holy water on that revolution. They just weren't. That's a Christian thing. It's holy water. You still believe in that? I do. I'm a good Maronite boy. I think that the issue of war is addressed by us best as Americans. As what do we get? What will it do for us? Will it work? Will it make the Middle East safer or better? I mean, look, I put it this way. Since the end of Vietnam, we've sent more money, sent more weapons, sent more troops, fought more wars, lost more lives in the Middle East than anywhere else in the world. We have more interests at risk, more allies at stake, and we've made a mess of it and do not understand the region at all. At all. We send our kids into war in that part of the world, they haven't got a clue. They went through the streets of Baghdad thinking it was Paris, World War II. It wasn't. They were being viewed as the Mongols, not as the liberators. And we didn't even understand what it meant when people said Mongol. We don't have a cultural reference point. We need teachings about Iran. If we're going to get into this, we need a teach-in on our campuses and in our communities, and you can be the interlocutors for the American people about a part of the world they need to know about, but do not. And on the issue of diaspora, one point. Look, this has been an issue my entire life. My entire life is trying to prove I'm an American. Or you can say, oh, don't be so defensive about it. Damn it, it's been an issue. My dad almost got fired at the State Department. You know, because he was the Arab guy who wrote Arab things. And he didn't, if you read what he wrote, but people in Congress didn't even read what he wrote. He was the Arab guy at the State Department. They didn't want him there. And the issue is, you know, I'd go to a thing and they'd say, oh, well, first we'll hear from the Israeli point of view, then from the Arab point of view. I'd say, no, not the Arab point of view. I'm an American kid. I played Little League. I went one time with Martin and Dick on Daniel Short at a radio show. Martin was Australian at the time. He hadn't even become an American citizen. And he was working for APAC. Actually, at that point, he left and he was at the Washington Institute. Very bright guy, good guy. We were debating the pros and cons of Iraq. And Daniel Short at one point said, what should we be saying to the Iraqi people? And Martin answered, and then I said what we should be saying. He stopped on air live and said, when you say we, who do you mean? For our listeners' sake. Well, son, that really got me. Because the issue is that some folks can get away with it. We can't. We have to always be American. And I know it sounds awful weird and defensive and stuff, and I've got these ugly Arab guys out there who are, there's one angry Arab guy, he's attacking me all the time for being an Uncle Tom and all that stuff. But the reality is that the survival and security of our community here, I mean, other people don't get FBI following them around because they got the attachment back to their homeland. You know, you can vote in Israeli elections, nobody gives a good damn, right? But you get involved too much in Lebanese or Syrian or Lebanese or Palestinian politics, it's a security. Number one, it's a security risk. Number two, too many people are questioning your loyalty as Americans. Number three, my daddy got on a boat and came over here and didn't want me voting in Lebanon elections. Didn't want me in seeing myself as an exile with, am I with Jaja this week, or with Jumblat, or with Hariri, or with, that's not my politics. My politics is Obama-Romney. That's my politics. I choose this one. I think that identity is a choice, and the choice I believe we should make, and not just for me, because I do the ethnic council in the Democratic Party, it's the same thing for everybody. I don't think we should be voting in Armenian elections. I don't think we should be voting in Iraqi elections. I don't think we should be having ballot boxes in the Indian embassy for Indian, because if everybody in America gets to vote in the countries they come from, number one, they'll be voting for people who, the choice they make, they'll not have to live with that choice. I'll vote for somebody in Lebanon, I won't have to live with that choice, they will. And number two, it undercuts the value of my citizenship here.
Thank you, Dr. Zogby.
Sorry.
Certainly there's that issue of whose side are you on? And as a member of any kind of heritage, we're constantly asked that question. I think Tom Dine was just asked that question in some way. So it's a question that faces every single one of us. But I think strategic diaspora members are American to the core, but they're also loyal to the heritage where they come from, and that's not a choice. They believe in both, and they want a win-win for both, and I think that's what we try to vote for us. I think Mr. Dine has some comments before I take more questions from the audience.
I just like the use of the term heritage. I think you ought to drop the other stuff. And Jim, I've known you a long time, and you're smart as hell, but you are too defensive. And we can talk about it over dinner. You'll pay for it, but that's all right. Having said that, it's been difficult for those of Jewish extraction. Most of us in this country have come, our grandparents, great-grandparents came from Europe. And it dawned on me at a particular time after I graduated college, I'm not a Lithuanian American. I don't want to be a Lithuanian anything. And in our community, we didn't, a couple of places would put that place of heritage in front of the American. But on the whole, it has been easy for my grandparents and parents fought to be Americans, and for me there wasn't any difficulty with that. But let me pick up also. Jim talked about educating, teach-ins, whatever. One of the things that I feel very good about what I did at APAC in my 13 years was I started a student program. And we went on as many campuses as possible. Now they're on campuses that don't have football teams. I don't know where some of these places are. But those students, through their own life's choices, got involved in public service, private sector, but I meet them all the time in various and curious places around the world, and they've really accomplished a great deal. You asked about, you cited my quote, "I don't work for big." This, you now give me a chance to reflect. On September 1st, 1982, President Reagan gave a televised address offering a peace process to the Israelis and the Palestinians. And at the time, I think they used the word Arab more than Palestinian. And King Hussein rejected it, Begin rejected it, and I gave an interview in the New York Times, a front page, lobby head supports peace process. Well, it was what I believed. Bernie Gertzman had called me, and I gave an interview, and I told him exactly what I felt. And I said there were many positive elements to Reagan's speech and plan. Well, hell broke loose within the American Jewish community. Who in the hell is this guy Dine? But it turned out to be a smart move without having calculated it. Because a couple of days later, Sovereign Shatila took place, and we had credibility on Capitol Hill because I had shown that I didn't work for, some said, anybody, that I worked for an organization and a cause, but I certainly didn't work for Megan. By chance, my wife and I were invited to the Israeli embassy for a sit-down dinner the next night after the article appeared. And I happened to be talking to somebody at the embassy, and you could feel the tension, telephone call. And I said, well, should we come to the dinner? He said, oh, sure, just don't stand underneath the chandelier. So you take your chances, be true to yourself. That's what we're really talking about.
I got 3 questions from the other side last time. Any questions from this side of the room? Yes, and please keep it to 30 seconds.
The Iranian community hasn't had the kind of trauma that Armenian community and the Jewish community has had. So
We don't recommend it.
Do you know the
but I feel that this is some sort of a axe like glue that helps you overcome differences. What do you think that a community such as ours can do in order to overcome our differences?
Other questions? Yes, sir.
My question is directed to Mr. Dine. I'm quite familiar with your some of the outreach programs within the Jewish organizations. In Atlanta, my business partner is Jewish, and he's on the committee of Jewish and Indian friendship group. And don't you think the government of Iran one day is going to go and you need a lot of friends, Iranian friends? And isn't this the kind of program that should be promoted? I know Trita has talked about it on a couple of occasions, but this is something I think should come from within the Jewish, different organizations, within the Jewish organizations and so on.
Thank you. Another question from the guest?
Yes, a question for Mr. Dine. I'm wondering what your sense is on our approach or a possible way to approach APAC today as opposed to the APAC that you were affiliated with back then. Thank you.
Let's take a couple more because we only have 10 minutes left. The gentleman there, Lily. Sure.
Thank you. Just a couple of brief questions. One, how do your organizations interact with and or collaborate with other organizations that are also serving your respective communities? And two, Dr. Zogby, you spoke about airing out your differences, and there are so many, with the exception of valuing education and preserving heritage. I think there are disagreements on every fundamental issue you can imagine within our community. How do you air those out without giving others fodder to divide and conquer if that's their goal with our community?
Thank you.
That's a really good question. How do you overcome differences? Again, I'll be very frank. There are generally two approaches to dealing with intra-community differences, right? One is what I'll call a horizontal approach, which is you invite people to meetings and you talk and you hammer out a consensus. Really good if you can do it. Extremely difficult. It's difficult. It involves a lot of pain and you have a lot of vanity, a lot of turf stuff. So, but it can be done, right? So one approach is you just constantly bring all the stakeholders together and you talk and work it out and sincerely try to develop a consensus. That's one approach. It works sometimes. The second approach is a vertical approach, which is different voices compete for leadership of a given constituency, and the healthiest and most robust in kind of like a Darwinian competition emerge as the strongest. They get the most donors, they get the most activists, they get the most traction politically, and they emerge as the leaders. That tends to work more often. I will never give up on the first consensus building, cooperation approach, but recognize also that we're not going to wait. This train does not have, every passenger on this train is not going to break, right? If NIAC is taking off from the train station, people can join, we'll do great things. If they think they can do better, let them form their own organization, let them compete. Let's see how it all works out. My guess is that the healthy will emerge as the strongest. So I put a big emphasis on, you got a little competition, open, kind of free society thing, but eventually you'll see the healthy forces emerge. I consider NIAC one of those forces, and people should get on that train. I'll close with this, and I won't offer another comment, which is, all of you are here from different parts of the country. It took an effort to spend a weekend away from home, away from work, away from the family. So you guys have bought into the idea that you made the trade-off to invest in an organization, which is really important. Being involved in an organization is a pain in the neck. It involves a lot of cost, a lot of expense, a lot of headaches. You have, my community, I'll speak for, is suspicious of authority, suspicious of government, suspicious of organizations that tell them what to do. There's all this kind of vanity and independent streak that people don't want to compromise anything that they have to an organization. But the reality is, as I said when I started, is that organization is the way to get things done. You'll make trade-offs, it'll be difficult, but the pros far outweigh the cons. So please continue your investment. I think it will pay off.
Thank you. Tom, you want to go first? We'll let James finish.
questions, and I'll try to go down the list that I kept. Somebody mentioned you need a lot of friends. You're darn right you do. And that starts within your own family, and then your neighbors, those with whom you work, those with whom you play. In any way, shape, or form, in building a consensus, in building a coalition, you befriend people and you explain to people what you believe in and how this would serve America. The Iranian community doesn't need introductions into the Jewish community. Half of Beverly Hills is Jewish, Iranian Jews, including the mayor. So you're way ahead. That doesn't mean you like each other, because that's always hard, as Aram just mentioned. Approaching APAC today, I have to be careful. I left in 1993, mid-93, and I've done a lot of things since. So I'm not part of the organization now. I know what I did, and I know much of what they're doing now, and it looks like what I was doing. But a major difference was I tried to say that we were in favor of peace in the neighborhood. Don't clap, because that would always silence my audience, Jewish audience. But I did. And I used to explain to, when I would see them, Prime Minister Begin, Prime Minister Shamir, Prime Minister Peres, that the American pro-Israel community, and that includes Jews and non-Jews, and of course the evangelicals now have really taken off. The American pro-Israel community is doing all this, this is my interpretation, in order to give you, Mr. Prime Minister, and fill in the blank, the option to make peace with the Palestinians. Begin and Shamir used to stare at me. They had a similar reaction every time I used that line. In fact, when Begin was not so happy with me, he'd go from calling me a young man to Mr. Guy, and his formality came out. Peres understood it, because he was motivated by something similar. So, you've got to approach and convince AIPAC that we want to provide Israel options to reach across the wall, to talk with the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, throughout the West Bank, and eventually Gaza. The other thing is, we've reached a stage where we're going to have to fight for a two-state solution. It isn't acknowledged anymore as a given, if only then XYZ happened. Both sides now have one-state solutions, and they're not the same one state. And I can't think of anything more tragic.
On the issue of differences in how you deal with it, I go with the Ram's thing with a slight twist. There'll be, when we poll, I think the biggest concern right now that I find with Iranian Americans when it comes to a uniquely Iranian American issue is the potential for a war with Iran. I don't think that takes a whole lot of discussion. You know, there's going to be some people in the community who think that's fine, let's do it. You know, I mean, what the hell? but they're in a minority. I think, you know, there'll be many other things that will divide people, but if that is an organizing principle that people can mobilize around, I think you got something that you can put everything else aside and say, what do we do to create alternatives to that war? What do we do other than buying Trita's book? And I'm not John Stewart, but I've been pushing it, man. And somebody actually wrote me just last week and wanted to know where the link was to my interview with you. So there, John Stewart. See, it's a family thing. My brother was on his show twice, and I never was on the show. And it doesn't bother me. And then Trita was on the show. No, look, I think that, you know, you have a gem with Trita, and it's not just the book, but it's the columns that come out. These are things to be studied, not just by me and you, but by people all over the country. And when I talked about a teach-in, I think that it is an opportunity for your community to take a leadership role in helping America not make a mistake. It's not about Iran, it's about us. It's about us doing the right thing and not going down a path that we will regret at some point. And I think that the community may not be 100% behind it, probably won't be. But enough of them will that y'all can make a difference. And that's why I'm focused. In my community, interestingly enough right now, we're just not seeing peace in the office. And we're also not sure where Arab Spring is playing out. But the big thing for us right now, and I know it's a concern in your community, if there were to be a war, is the civil liberties challenge. We're catching hell right now at the borders, at airports, and the NYPD situation in the New York situation is a mess. It is awful. And I know that Iranian Americans, that's what they tell us in the poll, are very concerned if there were to be a war, what the impact would be on discrimination and civil liberties here at home. You had the opportunity 2 years ago to ride a crest during the Green Movement and the revolution in Iran. And if anything showed the maturity and the readiness of Iranian Americans to play a role, you were everywhere. And I don't know if you discovered people that you didn't know before, but I discovered people I never knew before the networks did, where they were finding Iranian Americans climbing out of the woodworks who were articulate spokespeople for your community, a roster of people who can become national leaders in a way that would make your daddies and mommies proud that these young kids were able to take the leadership role that they were and be as articulate as they were on television. That should be mobilized and galvanized again, both around the war and also about your rights as a community. Because if there were to be a war, you would be in a different position than you were a couple of years ago. You would no longer be being viewed on the side of, because if you were opposed to that war, you would then be on the side against, I know, I've been there. It is uncomfortable, and for all of the credit you get, you know, you got 2 years ago, it would play the other way. It'd be, Trita Parsi is the apologist for, and he's not. And so the issue is prepare now for the teach-ins to talk about what our interests really are, and an alternative policy. I mean, Trita's laid it out. You have marvelous resources available to you in terms of what an American-Iranian policy ought to be. Get ready for a new administration. I don't mean a new person in the White House. We didn't vote for Bush in '84. But I think your community is at a pivotal point right now in the national debate, and you don't have to talk about a whole lot of things. When we find the demographics of Jewish and Muslim and Christian and regions, and I was struck by the remarkable coherency in views among all the different levels of Armenian society. The only real differences I noted was the difference between those with family in Iran and those not in Iran. That was the determinant, that was a difference maker, not whether Jewish or Muslim. So I think you have a great opportunity to mobilize that resource and that common ground approach to a new policy toward Iran. And I don't think it needs to be 501c3 or 4. I think it can be anything it wants to be. You're educating Americans, you're mobilizing the community, you're trying to avert a disaster, and you're trying to protect your rights here as Americans. And that would be an agenda to build on.
Thank you. Wonderful examples for us. The other, if I may call them, I won't call them diasporas, how about people of heritage? Every example can always be used some way. Let's not be like Cuban Americans who have actually helped keep sanctions alive for decades against their own people. But let's aim to learn these lessons, and a shout out to Indian Americans who are 1% of the US population, have 2 governors already in this country, and are pretty much all over the Obama administration and all over government, and starting from delegates. They just had 22 Sikh delegates in Charlotte. In 2008, they had 1 Sikh delegate. Now they have 22 Sikh delegates. So they are taking the book seriously from all of you, and they are very rapidly executing on that, including recruiting me to work for them. So thank you all. Please give a round of applause.